They laughed when Jonah Reed lost the hand, but by sunrise, not one of them could look the widow in the eye. The poker table sat under 3 oil lamps that smoked more than they shined, turning the air inside the dust-hollow saloon the color of old brass. Men leaned back in their chairs with whiskey on their breath and dust on their boots, grinning into their glasses like they had paid good money to watch a decent man get cornered. Jonah had seen bad nights before. He had slept in dry creek beds, ridden through April hail, gone 2 days on coffee and jerky alone. But there was something meaner in that room than hunger or weather. It was the kind of meanness that comes easy to folks when they believe a woman has already been lowered enough for public use. "A bet's a bet," somebody said near the stove, and the laughter rolled again, thick and lazy. Jonah did not answer. He kept his eyes on the cards spread before him, then on the hand that had beaten him, then finally on the man who had suggested the wager in the first place. Clay Barlow wore a smile too wide to be honest. He tapped the table with one finger and acted like fate had done the dealing. Jonah knew better. He had caught the flick of movement, the extra card, the quiet pass. But calling a cheat in a room full of his friends was like spitting into a prairie wind. It only came back in your face. "Go on," Clay said. "You said you'd stand by it." The piano in the corner had gone silent. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the barkeep leaned in, polishing the same spot with a rag gone gray at the edges. Jonah pushed his chair back slow, wood scraping against plank floor, and rose to his feet with the heavy patience of a man trying not to shame himself further. Then he turned, and that was when he saw her standing near the doorway with a little girl at her side. Eleanor Hayes wore a brown dress that had been mended so carefully a man could mistake the stitching for pride. The hem was clean but old. The sleeves were buttoned to the wrist. Her hat was plain, and the lamplight caught no jewelry on her, not even the small kind. The child beside her, maybe 7 years old, held onto her hand with both of hers, staring at the room as if she had wandered into church by mistake and found the pews full of wolves. Eleanor did not look frightened. That was what unsettled him. She looked tired in the way dry land looks tired after too many summers, still standing, still useful, but carrying cracks where no one could see them from a distance. A few men tipped their hats in mock ceremony. Somebody muttered, "Wedding gifts already there." Another man chuckled into his glass. Jonah felt the heat rise in his neck, not from embarrassment now, but from the easy cruelty of it. He had thought the joke was on him. He understood then that he was only half the punchline. Clay spread his arms. "Preacher's been sent for. You lose the hand, you marry the widow." That was the wager. He said widow the way some men said stray dog. Jonah looked at Eleanor, expecting anger, refusal, maybe a hard word he would deserve for being caught in something that touched her life. Instead, she met his eyes with a stillness that made the room seem smaller. She did not beg him to object. She did not ask for mercy from the men grinning around them. She only stood there, one hand wrapped around the child's fingers, and said, quiet enough that the room had to hush to hear it, "My daughter's feet are cold. If this spectacle is going to continue, I'd prefer it done before midnight." A strange thing happened then. For the first time that evening, nobody laughed. Jonah glanced down. The little girl's shoes were split near the toes. Not torn wide, just enough to let in the kind of spring chill that settles after dark in high country towns. A small thing. A man might miss it if he were still busy defending his pride. But Jonah had lived long enough to know a whole life could hide inside one small thing. He reached for his hat on the table. "What's her name?" he asked. Eleanor blinked once, surprised not by the question, but maybe by the fact that it had been asked at all. "Millie," she said. The child looked up at him, solemn as a courthouse clock. Jonah set the hat on his head and drew. A slow breath through the smell of spilled beer, lamp smoke, and cedar coming off the wet boards outside. He had no house to lose, no family waiting, no ranch deed folded in his pocket. The men in that room thought that made him empty. Maybe that was why they believed he could be wagered into another person's sorrow without consequence. But looking at Eleanor Hayes, Jonah felt something shift inside him, something that had nothing to do with cards and everything to do with the sharp, quiet shame of seeing dignity mocked in public. The preacher arrived 10 minutes later with his collar crooked and sleep still on his face. By then the night wind had started pressing dust against the front windows, and the whole town seemed to be listening from behind the dark. Jonah took his place beside Eleanor under the yellow light, hearing boots shuffle, hearing ice strike glass, hearing one old man clear his throat as if even he had begun to regret being there. Eleanor kept her chin level. Millie stood close to her skirt, leaning against the fabric like it was the only safe thing left in the room. When the preacher opened his worn Bible and began the words, Jonah did not look at the crowd again. He looked at the widow they had turned into a wager, and for reasons he could not yet name, he felt less like a man being trapped than a man being warned that the story told about her was a lie. Jonah Reed had slept in barn lofts that smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, under wagons with one wheel cracked, beside cook fires gone cold before midnight, but he had never spent a night quite like the one that followed. Eleanor Hayes led him out of the saloon without ceremony, one hand on Millie's shoulder, her own back straight as a fence post in winter. The town watched them go from porches and windows, and from the kind of shadows people choose when they want to witness something without owning it. Dust moved low across the street in pale ribbons, and the boardwalk creaked under Jonah's boots, as if even the planks had opinions. He walked half a step behind them, hat low, jaw set, carrying the silence like a saddle he had not asked to lift. Nobody threw rice. Nobody offered blessings. All the usual words that belonged to a wedding had stayed inside the church walls of better towns, and Dust Hollow, for all its painted storefronts and fresh signs, had never been a better town. Eleanor's house stood near the edge of settlement where the street gave up pretending to be a street and turned into packed earth cut by wagon ruts. It was a small place with a sloping roof, a hand pump near the side yard, and a patch of fencing that leaned like it had been praying for repairs all winter. A lantern burned in the front window. That surprised him. Something about the warm square of light made the place seem less defeated than the gossip around it. Eleanor opened the door, let Millie in first, then stood aside for Jonah without looking at him. The room smelled faintly of flour, lamp oil, and juniper smoke. It was cleaner than most boarding houses and poorer than any place with a real chance of getting ahead. There was a table by the stove, 3 chairs, a narrow shelf with plates stacked neat, and a rag rug worn thin in the middle by years of feet that had earned their supper honestly. Millie went straight to a little cot in the corner and sat down to unlace her shoes. Eleanor took off her hat and placed it on a peg by the door. Her hair was pinned up plain and practical, dark blonde in the lamp glow, with one loose strand at her temple that looked too soft for a town that hard. Jonah removed his own hat and waited for some instruction, some accusation, some piece of this strange arrangement to declare itself in terms a man could manage. Instead, Eleanor crossed to the stove, laid in 2 short sticks of wood, and said, "There is a blanket in the cedar chest if you are staying till morning." Her voice was not warm, but it was not cruel either. It carried the calm fatigue of someone who had long ago run out of room for dramatics. Jonah glanced toward the door. The night beyond it was black and broad, and a younger version of himself would have stepped back into it without a second thought. A horse, a sky, a strip of trail under moonlight. That had been enough for years. Enough after his father drank away. The last winter's feed. Enough after his mother was buried on a windy hill outside Abilene. Enough after he learned that a man could drift so long, he started mistaking movement for freedom. He had told himself he preferred it that way. No debts, no promises, no one waiting on a porch light. But standing in that narrow room, watching Millie tug at a shoe too stiff to bend, and Eleanor move about the stove with care that made every object seem worth protecting, he felt the old life thinning at the edges. "I can leave," he said at last. Eleanor set a black kettle on the iron top and kept her eyes on the fire. "I know. That was all. Not stay. Not go. Not you owe us. Just I know." It landed heavier than pleading would have. Millie looked up from the cot. "Mama, is he mad?" she asked. Eleanor turned then, and whatever reserve had settled over her face softened by a small degree at the sound of the child's voice. "No," she said. "He is only trying to decide what sort of man he wants to be after a long night." Jonah almost smiled at that, though he did not think he had earned one. He took a seat at the table, careful with the chair, careful with his hands, as if too much noise might break something already strained. On the far wall hung a framed photograph, clouded with age. A man and woman stood beside a wagon, young and stiff in the way people looked when pictures cost money. The woman was Eleanor, or a younger version of her with more sunlight in her face. The man beside her wore suspenders and a hopeful expression Jonah had seen on settlers before the land and weather taught them arithmetic. Daniel Hayes, he assumed. The dead husband. The ghost every fool in town used as a reason to lower their voice around her, while saying cruel things all the same. Beside the frame hung a child's drawing done in charcoal on paper, so worn it had gone nearly silver at the folds. A house, a horse, 3 lopsided flowers, and a stick figure taller than the rest. Family made visible by simple lines. Millie followed his gaze. That is from last spring, she said. The horse looks like a dog, but Mama said not every horse gets to be handsome. Eleanor set 3 tin cups on the table and poured hot water over grounds that had already been used once, maybe twice. The coffee came out weak, but it steamed, and that counted for something. She slid a cup toward Jonah and finally met his eyes head on. There was no fear in them. No gratitude either. Only caution, pride, and some deeper weariness that had settled in like weather in old wood. You may sleep on the settee, she said. I do not take charity, and I do not offer performances. In the morning, if you choose to go, I will not stand in your path. Jonah wrapped both hands around the cup. It barely tasted of coffee, but it held heat. Outside, the wind pressed dust against the window glass with a soft, dry hiss. Inside, Millie yawned and leaned against her mother's arm. Eleanor rested a hand on the child's hair, and the gesture was so unpracticed in its tenderness, so careful, that Jonah understood all at once how long the two of them had been managing alone. Not thriving, not healing, managing. He looked again at the room, at the patched curtains, the swept floor, the folded mending basket near the lamp, the clean plates drying on a towel. A whole life held together not by luck, but by refusal to let it come apart. Men in the saloon had spoken of Eleanor Hayes like she was a burden waiting to be handed off. Yet nothing in that house felt like burden. It felt like endurance. And endurance, Jonah knew, was a far lonelier thing. He drank the weak coffee and listened to the small household sounds gather around him. The stove ticking, Millie's breathing slowing, the lantern glass faintly humming with heat. He had ridden across half the West chasing wages, weather, and the wide-open comfort of not being known. But sometime near midnight, seated in a stranger's kitchen with his hat on his knee and a borrowed blanket folded beside him, Jonah Reed began to suspect that a man could spend years outrunning loneliness and still not know what it looked like until he saw it set 3 cups on a table instead of 2. Morning came thin and colorless through the front window, the sort of pale western dawn that made every board, nail, and coffee cup look more honest than it had by lamplight. Jonah Reed woke on the settee with one boot still on and a crease in his shoulder from the hard wooden arm, and for a few seconds he did not remember where he was. Then he heard the pump outside give its rusty groan, followed by the splash of water in a tin bucket, and the memory of the night before settled over him in one quiet piece. He sat up, ran a hand over his face, and looked across the room. The cot in the corner was empty. The blanket folded over Millie's pillow had already been straightened. On the table sat a plate with 2 biscuits covered by a towel, not an invitation exactly, but not indifference either. He crossed to the window and saw Eleanor in the yard, sleeves rolled to the wrist, drawing water with the kind of practiced economy that belongs to people who do not waste motion because they cannot afford to waste anything else. Millie stood near the fence in her same worn shoes, talking to a hen that did not seem interested in conversation. The yard looked even smaller in daylight. A leaning chicken coop, a narrow strip of hard ground where a garden had once tried and failed, a shed with one hinge sagging on the door, and beyond all of it the broad, empty land rolling out under a sky too large for any one person's troubles. Jonah stepped outside carrying his hat in one hand. The air still held the cold edge of night, and somewhere farther off a horse snorted from a neighboring lot. Eleanor glanced at him once and set the bucket down. There is coffee, she said. Weak, but warm. Jonah nodded. Thank you. Millie turned and gave him a look that was more curious than shy now, as if sleep had made the strange arrangement less alarming. Mama said you might leave after breakfast, she announced with the bluntness only a child could carry without malice. Eleanor gave her daughter a small warning look, but Jonah only crouched a little so they were nearer eye level. Your mother says sensible things, he said. Millie considered that, and then pointed toward the broken fence rail near the shed. That one falls every time the wind blows hard. Jonah followed the line of her finger. The rail leaned out at an angle and had been tied once with old rope now gone stiff and gray. Beyond it, a patch of ground had been trampled into a path leading to the pump, then to the coop, then back to the house. The whole place carried the same message as the shoes, the coffee, the mended dress. Things had not been abandoned. They had been held together as long as two hands could manage, and not much longer. He straightened slowly. Do you have a hammer? Eleanor watched him for a moment, weighing something private behind her eyes. In the shed, she said. Second shelf, if the handle has not split from the weather. Jonah told himself he was only fixing one rail because a child had pointed to it, because a house should not lean more than the people inside it already had, because the morning was cold and his hands knew better how to work than to leave. He found the hammer, a coffee can half full of bent nails, and two spare boards stacked against the wall behind a sack of feed gone nearly empty. The shed smelled of old pine, dry dirt, and the faint sweet trace of apples that must have been stored there last fall. He carried the boards out into the light and set to work. The first strike rang sharper than expected in the stillness of the yard. Millie flinched, then smiled. Eleanor said nothing. She moved inside and returned with the wash basin, setting shirts and flour sack towels to soak, while Jonah measured the rail by eye and cut the board with a small handsaw from the shed. Sawdust curled pale at his boots. The sun climbed another inch. Dust Hollow began to stir in the distance with wagon wheels and voices drifting from the road. But out there at the edge of town the morning held together in its own quiet rhythm. Millie came to stand beside him after a while, careful not to crowd. Were you always a cowboy? She asked. Jonah fitted the board into place and drove in a nail with 3 firm strokes. No, he said. I was a boy first. I was not much good at it. That earned him a laugh, quick and silver, and Eleanor looked up from the wash basin before she could stop herself. It was only a glance, but it had surprise in it. Jonah worked on. 1 rail turned into 2. Then the shed hinge needed tightening. Then the coop latch showed a split where the wood had worn through. Each job led to the next in the plain way honest things often do. By mid-morning, he had taken off his coat. The sun was warm on the back of his neck, and his shirt clung faintly at the shoulders. Eleanor brought out a tin cup of water and held it toward him without a word. He took it. Their fingers did not touch, yet something passed between them anyway. Not affection, not trust, not yet, but an acknowledgement that silence itself could change shape. He drank and handed the cup back. Your husband build the shed? He asked, keeping his tone even. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the roofline before returning to the cup in her hand. Daniel started it, she said. Weather finished most of the rest. There was no tremor in the answer, but there was an end to it, a closed gate he did not step toward. Millie wandered to the porch and sat cross-legged with a stick, drawing circles in the dirt. A few minutes later she looked up and asked, Are you staying for supper? Children had a way of stepping straight into questions grown folks walked around all day. Jonah rested the hammer against his thigh. He might have said no. It would have been easier. Cleaner. He could have saddled up by noon, ridden west until the town was nothing but a blur in the dust, and kept the story of that wedding filed away with every other strange piece of country he had passed through. But the fence stood straighter now. The shed door shut clean. There was biscuit flour on Eleanor's sleeve where she had brushed her hand against it, and a looseness in Millie's posture that had not been there last night. Little things. Yet a whole life could hide inside one small thing. Jonah looked toward the open land, then back at the house. I reckon I can stay till evening, he said. Millie grinned like Sunrise had chosen her porch on purpose. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the cup, and though her face did not change much, he could have sworn some hard, invisible knot inside the yard loosened all at once. By late afternoon the light had turned the yard the color of dry wheat, and the house no longer looked quite so lonesome to Jonah Reed. Work had a way of changing a place before anyone inside it was ready to admit it. The fence stood straighter. The shed door closed without that tired scrape against the ground. The coop latch caught proper on the first try, and Millie tested it 3 times with the solemn pride of a deputy inspecting the jail. Jonah set the hammer down on the porch rail and rolled the stiffness from his shoulders. His hands were dusty. His shirt carried the smell of pine and iron, and there was sweat dried under his collar where the noon sun had found him. None of that bothered him. What unsettled him was how natural it had begun to feel hearing small household sounds around him. A kettle warming. A chair being moved across plank floor. a child humming to herself while lining up smooth stones on the porch step as if they were guests at some quiet supper. He had spent too many years in places where the only evening sound was wind rubbing through grass or men laughing too loud in a bunkhouse, so nobody had to think about the silence waiting after. This silence was different. It carried breath in it. Purpose. Eleanor came out with a basket of wash balanced on one hip and crossed toward the line behind the house. Jonah moved to take it from her without thinking. She paused, studied him for a second, then let him. The basket was lighter than it ought to have been, which told him more than he wanted to know. Too few shirts. Too few towels. A household stretched thin enough that even its laundry seemed careful not to ask for much. Together they hung the things in the late breeze, not close enough to brush hands, not far enough to pretend they were strangers any longer. Millie had added one sock that looked no bigger than Jonah's palm. It spun on the line like a white flag. "You do not have to keep finding repairs," Eleanor said after a while, pinning a flour sack towel by its corners. "I know that," Jonah answered. He clipped a work shirt to the line and watched the cloth snap softly in the breeze. "Then why are you?" The question came plain, without softness, but without accusation. That was her way. He was learning. She did not decorate her words, because life had already taken the pretty edges off too many things. Jonah looked out beyond the yard where the land faded into open country, all of it bronze and blue under the long reach of the sky. "Maybe because I noticed them," he said. And once a man notices a thing coming apart, it gets harder to walk past. Eleanor kept her eyes on the next pin. Most folks in Dust Hollow have no trouble with that. He did not answer. He did not need to. The truth of it hung there between the towels and shirts, light as cloth and hard as fence wire. Near sundown, Millie asked if he knew how to whittle. Jonah found a pocket knife in his coat and a piece of cedar scrap from the shed, then sat on the porch step while she settled beside him with her knees pulled up under her chin. The smell of fresh-cut cedar rose warm and sweet each time the blade shaved another curl free. He made her a little horse no longer than 4 inches, rough in the legs but decent in the head, and she held it like it had come from a fancy mercantile window instead of a splintered board. "Does it need a name?" she asked. "Everything with 4 legs usually does," Jonah said. She thought hard, then decided the horse looked like a Walter. He told her that was a serious name for a cedar horse. She said that was exactly why it fit. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching them with one hand resting against the frame, half in the house and half out of it, like she still did not believe the scene belonged to her yard. There was flour on her wrists and a faint flush in her cheeks from the stove. The evening light struck the side of her face and softened something there. Not enough to turn her girlish, not enough to erase what hardship had carved in, but enough for Jonah to see what she might have looked like years ago in that photograph on the wall, when Hope had still sat beside her openly. "Supper is ready," she said. The room smelled of beans, onions, and cornbread baked in a skillet blackened by use. It was a humble meal, the kind Jonah had eaten 100 times in 100 places, yet none of those meals had been set with the quiet order Eleanor brought to a table. 3 plates. 3 cups. The good spoon given to Millie because children notice such things. Jonah washed his hands at the basin by the door before he sat down. Eleanor noticed that too, though she said nothing. They ate with the sort of stillness that belongs to people not yet familiar enough for ease, but no longer guarded enough for ceremony. Millie talked some, mostly to Walter the cedar horse, and once she told Jonah the hen with the crooked comb was called Mrs. Peabody because she judged everyone. Jonah said that sounded accurate. Eleanor's mouth nearly smiled into her cup. It was there and gone, but he saw it. After supper, while Millie traced circles in the fogged corner of the window with one finger, Eleanor folded the dish towel and said, "You can leave in the morning without offending me." The words were calm. Too calm. Jonah looked at her across the table. "Is that what you want?" She held his gaze only a second before turning it toward the stove. One has not had much say here for a long time. There was no self-pity in it, which made it land harder. Outside, a wagon rattled somewhere down the road. A dog barked twice and gave up. The house settled around them with small wooden creaks, the sound of old boards adjusting to cooling air. Jonah leaned back in his chair and looked at the room again. But this time he saw what he had missed before. On the shelf beside the plates sat a jar with only 2 pennies in it. On the nail by the door hung a child's coat turned inside out for mending at the seams. Near the stove was a pair of women's gloves with one thumb darned in darker thread. Not poverty by itself. He had seen worse. This was the look of people who had kept dignity so long it had become another form of labor. "What happened to your well bucket?" he asked, remembering the frayed rope at the pump and the worn lip of the metal pail. Eleanor seemed surprised by the question. "The handle snapped in January. I mended it. And the garden? No water to spare. After August. And the roof over the back room." She glanced upward as if she could see through the ceiling to the patchwork above. "It leaks when spring storms come hard from the south." Jonah rested his forearms on the table. "Then I should stay one more day." The words came out before he measured them, but once spoken, they felt steadier than most decisions he had made in years. Millie looked up from the window with such naked hope in her face that he had to look away for a moment. Eleanor did not answer right off. She stood very still, one hand on the back of her chair, the lamplight catching the fine weariness under her eyes. Then she said, almost too quietly to hear, "You do not owe us another day." Jonah met her gaze. "No," he said. "I suppose that is why it can be given." For a long second, nothing moved in the room but the lamp flame. Then Eleanor lowered her eyes, and the hand on the chair loosened by a fraction, as if something inside her had been braced against disappointment for so long it no longer knew how to rest. The next morning arrived with a cleaner light and a thinner wind, the kind that made the boards of the porch glow pale gold before the sun climbed high enough to turn everything hard again. Jonah Reed was up before the kettle, before the hens, before Millie's small footsteps crossed the floor, and he stood in the yard looking up at the back slope of the roof where Eleanor had said the spring rain found its way in. From down below, the patch looked old and tired, a square of weathered tin nailed over split shingles by a hand that had meant well and run short on time, money, or both. He fetched the ladder from the shed, tested each rung, then carried up a coil of rope, a pouch of nails, and the last of the spare boards he had found behind the feed sack. The roof smelled of sun-warmed dust and dry wood. From there he could see most of Dust Hollow spread out in the distance, false front stores lined along the main road, a church steeple that leaned almost too slight to notice, and beyond all of it the open country rolling away under a sky so wide it made every human promise seem smaller than it ought to be. He worked on his knees, steady and careful, lifting loose shingles, resetting what could be saved, replacing what could not, and by the time the sun stood a hand's width above the horizon, he heard the back door open below him. Eleanor stepped into the yard with her apron tied on and one hand shielding her eyes from the glare. She looked up, and for a moment the morning held there between them, quiet as breath. "You could have woken me," she called. Jonah drove in another nail before answering. "You look like someone who had not slept enough in a year." He did not mean it as kindness exactly, only as truth, but something in her expression changed all the same. Not softness. She did not hand that out carelessly. More like surprise that a man had noticed without being told. She nodded once and disappeared back inside. When he came down later, shirt damp at the spine and hands rough with splinters, a plate of biscuits and sorghum sat on the table, with a cup of coffee darker than yesterday's. Millie was already awake, Walter the cedar horse tucked under one arm, while she swung her feet beneath the chair. "Mama says roof men get the first biscuit," she informed him. Eleanor, standing at the stove with her back half turned, said, "I said a man who works should eat while the food is warm." Millie improves most things when she repeats them. Jonah sat down without arguing. The biscuit was plain, the coffee still short on strength, but the meal carried a strange comfort he had never found in chuck wagon stews or saloon breakfasts. It tasted of being expected at a table. Afterward, he repaired the loose shutter near the front window, then reset one porch board that had begun to tilt underfoot. Millie followed him from task to task like a solemn little foreman, holding nails in both palms and asking questions with the serious concentration of a child trying to learn how the world kept itself upright. Did horses dream standing up? Had he ever seen snow in May? Could a fence remember who built it? Jonah answered as best he could, which was not always well, but she never seemed to mind. Eleanor moved through the house and yard around them, kneading dough, sweeping the back step, carrying feed to the hens, mending a cuff by the window where the light was best. Now and then Jonah caught her glancing toward him, not suspicious the way she had at first, but uncertain in a different way, as if she had lived so long with the expectation that help always came with a price that simple effort looked almost harder to trust. Near noon he found the side gate dragging in the dirt and lifted it free of its hinges to trim the lower edge. As he worked, Millie crouched beside a cracked flower pot near the porch and dug gently with a spoon. "These used to be Mama's bluebells," she said, "before the water got mean." Jonah paused with the plane in his hand. "Water got mean?" Millie nodded as though it were the most sensible thing in the world. "That is what Mama says when the pump coughs mud or when the creek shrinks away from everybody except rich men's cattle." Children repeated what homes could not hide. Jonah set the gate against the wall and walked over to the pump, studying the trough, the bucket, the patched handle, the ground packed hard by careful use. A few yards beyond the house the garden bed lay dry and faded, its rows still visible under the weeds like old handwriting under newer marks. He looked toward the north side of town where the larger properties sat closer to the better water routes. And though Eleanor had never spoken more than a sentence at a time about her troubles, he began to feel the shape of them all the same. Not one bad season, not one broken tool, something slower and meaner than that. Something that could drain a house without ever stepping through the door. He rehung the gate and straightened. Eleanor stood on the porch with a folded shirt in her hands, watching him. "Millie talks too much," she said, though there was no real irritation in it. "No," Jonah answered. "She talks enough." Eleanor came down the steps and handed him the shirt. It was his, washed and dried and stitched where the sleeve seam had started to split. He stared at the neat line of mending, then at her. "You did not have to." "Neither did you," she said. The air between them held still. Somewhere out by the road a wagon rattled past, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the open kitchen window. Jonah ran a thumb over the repaired seam. It was small work, maybe 10 minutes by lamplight, but a whole life could hide inside one small thing. A woman with little thread still spending some on a shirt that might ride away tomorrow. He lifted his eyes. "Thank you." Eleanor inclined her head, and for the first time since that night in the saloon, something close to ease crossed her face. It did not stay long, but it was there. That afternoon a cloud bank gathered low in the west, gray underbellies rolling over the bright sky in slow silence. Jonah checked the roof once more, weighted the loose tarp over the woodpile, and brought the wash in ahead of the weather. Millie sat at the table drawing Walter a barn on the back of an old feed invoice while Eleanor mixed beans with bacon drippings in a cast-iron pot. When the first drops began to strike the window, light and scattered, all three of them looked up at once. The roof held. No drip in the back room. No pan dragged across the floor. No muttered apology from Eleanor to a child too young to have caused any of it. Just rain, simple and decent, tapping the house like a visitor instead of an enemy. Millie smiled toward the ceiling as if she had been personally vindicated. Eleanor stood still by the stove, one hand resting on the spoon, listening. Jonah could not remember when he had last felt proud over something as plain as a dry room, but the feeling settled in him deep and sure. Then Eleanor turned, and in the soft gray light from the window, she gave him a look that carried more weight than gratitude. It carried recognition, as if after all her long months of bracing herself against disappointment, she had finally allowed one corner of her heart to believe that this man, at least for now, meant exactly what he did. The rain left behind a wash-clean morning and a smell of wet earth that clung low over the yard like something almost hopeful. Dust Hollow looked gentler after weather. Though Jonah Reed had lived long enough to know towns only borrowed grace from rain and gave it back by noon. The boards of the porch were dark with damp, the pump handle shone with beads of water, and the hard ground around the house had softened just enough to hold the prints of 3 pairs of feet. Millie noticed it first. She ran out after breakfast with Walter the cedar horse in one hand and called for Jonah to come see how the yard remembered people. He stepped onto the porch with his coffee and found her crouched near the steps, tracing the outline of her own boot print with one finger as if it were something rare and worth preserving. "This one is mine," she said, "and that bigger one is yours. Mama's are the neat ones because she walks like she has somewhere to be." Jonah glanced toward the doorway. Eleanor stood inside with a dish towel in her hands, listening though she pretended not to. The corner of her mouth gave the smallest hint of surrender before she turned back to the table. The morning passed with quiet chores. Jonah checked the roof one last time after the storm, tightened the strap on the pump bucket, and split a little more cedar for the woodbox. Eleanor baked 2 loaves of bread instead of 1, which told him more than any invitation. Millie drew the rain prints until the sun dried them off the ground. For a while it was enough simply to work and let the day move without asking too much of it. Near midday, while Eleanor kneaded dough by the window and Millie sat on the floor making Walter inspect each knot in the rug, Jonah carried in a warped crate from the shed that had been filled with old tools, bent hinges, and pieces of lumber too useful to throw away. He set it near the wall and crouched to sort through it, hoping to find a length of sound wire for the side gate. The crate smelled of old cedar, dust, and years shut away. Most of what it held was what a poor house always held at the edges of itself, parts of things waiting for another chance. A rusted lantern without a globe, a saw handle wrapped in twine, a small mason jar of screws saved from better days. At the bottom, beneath a square of canvas and a broken harness buckle, his fingers brushed something cold and smooth. He drew it out and found a silver ring, bent slightly out of round, its surface scratched but still carrying a faint engraved line of tiny leaves along one side. It was too narrow for a man's hand. A woman's ring, perhaps, or a keepsake meant to be hidden rather than worn. Beneath it lay a folded paper stiff with age and watermarks. Jonah did not open it at first. He only looked at the 2 things in his palm, feeling without knowing why that the room had changed around him. Eleanor must have sensed it, because the sound of kneading stopped. "What is that?" she asked, and her voice had gone so still it scarcely sounded like hers. Jonah held the items up, found them in the shed crate. Millie looked up with bright interest, but Eleanor crossed the room before the child could rise. When she saw the ring, all the color went out of her face in one quiet sweep. She set the towel down on the table, wiped flour from her hands though there was no need, and stood staring at Jonah's open palm as if memory itself had taken shape there. "I thought those were gone," she said. The words came low and almost to herself. Millie glanced between them. "Gone where?" she asked. Eleanor looked at her daughter then, and whatever answer first rose in her must have been for an older child, because she let it pass. "Gone with winter things," she said gently. "Go feed Mrs. Peabody the corn by the door, sweetheart." Millie hesitated only long enough to know grown folks had entered a room children could not follow, then gathered Walter under her arm and slipped outside. The screen door gave its soft slap behind her. For a moment, only the clock on the shelf spoke, ticking out seconds no one seemed eager to use. Jonah laid the ring and folded paper on the table. "I am sorry," he said. "I should have asked before opening up old boxes." Eleanor shook her head once. "No, it is not that." She sat down slowly, as if her knees had lost certainty. In the daylight she looked less tired than she had the first night, but there were some wearinesses no amount of sleep touched. She took the ring first. Her thumb moved across the engraved leaves, back and forth, like a blind person learning a familiar face. "Again, Daniel bought this after our second harvest," she said. "Not because we had money to spare, because for one whole season we believed we finally might." Jonah said nothing. Silence was often the only decent place for grief to speak from. Eleanor set the ring down and touched the folded paper without lifting it. "That receipt is from the water office. Daniel kept every one of them. He said paper had a way of remembering what people wished it would forget." Jonah looked closer. The ink on the outside had faded, but one name remained dark enough to read. Daniel Hayes. Below it, in smaller print, the amount due for water rights. He felt something tighten in him. Millie said the creek shrank away from everybody except rich men's cattle. Eleanor gave a humorless breath that never made it as far as a laugh. "Millie hears more than I intend." She unfolded the paper carefully. The creases were fragile, but the figures were plain enough. Charges, dates, signatures. Small marks to some eye, maybe. To another, a noose woven out of ink. "After Daniel died, folks said it was bad luck that finished us," she said. "Bad weather. Bad business. A widow not built for ranch work. Those are comforting stories for a town. They let everyone sleep better." She met Jonah's eyes then, and there was no softness in hers now, only the old wound of having held truth too long in lonely hands. It was not luck. Outside, Millie laughed at something the hen had done, and the sound came bright through the window, almost painful against the gravity in the room. Jonah rested one hand on the table near the receipt but did not touch it. Then what was it? Eleanor looked toward the yard, as if making certain the child remained out there in the harmless business of corn and feathers. When she spoke again, each word seemed chosen the way poor people choose kindling in winter, careful not to waste a single piece. Daniel would not sell our water access to Caltervain. Other men did. Some because they were tired. Some because they were scared. Some because they thought his promises sounded cleaner than drought. Daniel said if a family gave up its water, it gave up the right to call the land its own. Her fingers tightened around the ring until the knuckles showed pale. After that, the fees changed. The routes changed. Deliveries came late or not at all. Paper said one thing. Thirst said another. Jonah felt the whole house shift in his understanding. The dead garden. The patched bucket. The careful loaves. The way Eleanor measured every gallon as if mercy itself came in pails. Not misfortune. Design. Not one terrible blow, but 100 quiet pressures aimed at a family until the world could call the collapse natural. He looked again at the receipt, then at the ring. A whole life could hide inside one small thing. A marriage. A promise. A theft nobody named as theft because it wore a vest and signed its name in town ledgers. Why keep these in the shed, he asked. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the paper. Because there are days I need to remember Daniel was not foolish. And other days I need to hide the proof before I start believing I can still do something with it. The room stayed still after that. Then, from out in the yard, Millie called that Mrs. Peabody had stolen twice as much corn as decent society should allow. Eleanor closed her eyes for one brief second, as if the child's voice had pulled her back from a long distance. When she opened them again, she slid the ring and receipt toward herself. But Jonah had already seen enough to know the story of that house was larger than loneliness, and far crueler. Whatever had dried the garden and hollowed the pantry had not come from weather alone. It had a name. And for the first time since he walked out of the saloon beside a woman everyone else had reduced to a joke, Jonah Reed began to understand that staying one more day might no longer be a matter of kindness, but of conscience. By the next afternoon, Dust Hollow had found a fresh reason to talk, and like most small towns with too much dust and too little grace, it talked loudest when a woman's name could be bent to fit the story men preferred. Jonah Reed heard the shift before he saw it. A pair of riders slowed near the yard instead of passing by. Two women at the dry goods porch lowered their voices only after they had made certain Eleanor could see them whisper. Even the boy who delivered flour from the mercantile stared a little too long at the front steps, as if he expected to witness something shameful simply because the town had decided shame belonged there now. Jonah was at the pump tightening the iron collar around the handle when the flour boy cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Vane says folks are beginning to wonder whether you mean to pay your own way or live off a widow's pantry." The words were rehearsed, borrowed from an older mouth, and they sat on the boy badly. Jonah straightened slow, wiped his hand on his trouser leg, and looked at him without anger. "Then Mr. Vane must be short on proper work if he has taken up accounting for my breakfasts." The boy blinked, took the coin Eleanor handed him, and left in such a hurry the flour sack thumped twice against his knee before he reached the gate. Eleanor stood on the porch holding the sack to her apron, her face unreadable in the noon glare. Millie was on the floor inside teaching Walter the cedar horse to jump over a Bible and 2 stacked spoons. The little game made the room sound younger than it had any right to. "He knows," Eleanor said after a moment. Jonah turned back to the pump. "Seems like he wants me to know that he knows." Eleanor set the flour in the kitchen and returned empty-handed. Calter Vane always preferred an audience. Her tone was steady, but Jonah heard the old weariness under it, that familiar brace in the voice of someone who had been pushed from too many angles for too long. "What does he want?" he asked. She gave a thin breath through her nose. "What he has always wanted. The last clean claim on this side of the water route. If he can take the house and the strip behind it, he closes the lane between his leased pasture and the North Feed Road. Cattle, wagons, men, all of it passes easier. And if people can tell themselves a widow failed by nature, then nobody has to say she was squeezed on purpose." Jonah looked toward the back of the property, where the fence line thinned into rough posts and stubborn ground. From a distance it seemed like nothing. Up close it was a home measured in boards, bread, patched sleeves, and a child's drawings on feed paper. A whole life could hide inside one small place. "Then he picked the wrong week," Jonah said. Eleanor almost smiled, but the expression did not reach the guarded part of her. That is kind of you to believe. It is not kindness. He tightened the last turn on the collar and tested the pump. Water came up steady, clear enough to catch the sun. It is annoyance. That won him a brief glance, and in that glance sat something warmer than amusement. Not trust exactly. Maybe the beginning of relief, trying not to show itself too soon. The trouble arrived just before supper, not with thunder or raised voices, but with the polite confidence of men who believed paper could do what weather had not. 3 riders came through the gate in a line neat enough to look planned. Coulter Vane rode in front on a bay gelding brushed to a banker's shine. He wore a dark coat too fine for ranch labor and a hat that had never met real rain. The 2 men behind him looked like what they were, hired company with blank faces and boots bought for standing near other men's decisions. Jonah saw Millie in the doorway and stepped into the yard before the horses could cast too much shadow over the porch. Eleanor came out behind him, wiping her hands on her apron once, then letting them fall still at her sides. Coulter removed his hat with the smooth courtesy of a man who used manners the way some men used fences, not to welcome, but to mark what he believed already belonged to him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I would have sent word, but matters of debt do not improve with distance." Eleanor's chin lifted by half an inch. "Then it is unfortunate you traveled all this way for one." Coulter's eyes shifted to Jonah, taking his measure in a glance too polished to be open contempt. "And this must be the gentleman husband." The word gentleman came out pressed thin. Dust Hollow does admire a quick ceremony. Jonah did not move. "State your business." Coulter smiled in a way that showed no joy in it. "Gladly. There is an outstanding claim against this property. Water fees, delivery penalties, delayed notes, and a filing cost from county review. I have been patient, which I fear has been mistaken for flexibility." He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers. "Since patience has not corrected the matter, I am here to offer a final convenience. Mrs. Hayes may sign over the house and rear strip tonight and save herself the ugliness of formal seizure." Millie had gone quiet behind the screen door. Jonah could feel the child's silence as clearly as if it had weight. Eleanor stepped off the porch, not far, only enough to stand on level ground with the man addressing her. "There is no lawful seizure coming," she said. "Half those charges were altered after Daniel died, and the other half were written to bury any small rancher too tired to fight them." Coulter's face did not change, but something in the air did, the way a room changes when a lamp flickers before going out. "Careful," he said softly. "Accusation is expensive when one cannot cover ordinary water." The 2 men behind him stayed still in their saddles, eyes forward, hands nowhere dramatic. Yet their silence carried the same old message towns had always taught widows and drifters alike. "You may object, but the objection will cost more than surrender." Jonah looked at the papers in Coulter's hand, then at the house, then at Eleanor, whose shoulders were square though he could see the pulse beating fast at the base of her throat. She was not frightened in the ordinary sense. She was tired of being cornered in daylight by men who called it business. Coulter extended the pages toward her. "Sign, and I will see that you and the child are allowed 2 weeks to gather your things." Millie made a small sound inside. Not quite a cry, not quite a word. Jonah stepped forward and took the papers before Eleanor could reach for them. Coulter's brows lifted by the smallest degree. Jonah read just enough to see what he already suspected. Numbers dressed to look official. Dates stacked close where none should have been. Penalties multiplied like locusts after drought. It was the kind of document built not to prove a debt, but to exhaust the person forced to answer it. He folded it once and handed it back. "No," Coulter's smile faded, though his voice stayed smooth. "I do not recall asking for your judgment, Mr. Reed." "Then you should have chosen a yard where I was not standing." The wind moved through the line of drying towels behind the house, carrying the clean smell of soap and sun. Dust swirled low around the horse's legs. Somewhere beyond the road a screen door slapped and stayed open, because half the town was surely listening by now, pretending not to. Coulter settled his hat back on his head. "You were a drifter 5 days ago," he said. "A lucky seat at a table and a borrowed marriage do not turn a man into a landholder." Jonah held his gaze. "No, but standing where you ought to stand can turn him into a problem." That landed. Not loudly. Coulter did not bark, did not bluster, did not reveal temper the way smaller men might have. He only studied Jonah with the cold patience of someone used to lesser souls stepping aside. "Be careful what you attach yourself to," he said at last. "A sinking house takes hold of more than one pair of boots on the way down." Eleanor spoke before Jonah could answer. "This house has survived more decent men than you." Coulter looked at her then, and for 1 second the polish slipped. Not into rage, into insulted certainty, as if the furniture of the world had dared speak back. He gathered the papers, clicked his tongue to the bay gelding, and turned the horse in a tight half-circle. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said without looking back. "After that, the town will witness what it witnesses." Then he rode out through the gate with his 2 quiet shadows behind him, leaving only hoof marks, a drifting line of dust, and the kind of silence that comes after somebody has tried to lay claim not just to your land, but to your right to remain human on it. Millie opened the screen and ran to Eleanor at once. Eleanor bent to her daughter, one hand smoothing the child's hair even though her own face had gone pale under the evening light. Jonah stood in the yard with the pump handle cool under one hand, the whole shape of the thing settling around him at last. This was never about unpaid notes alone. It was about spectacle, about making a woman sign away her home while men watched and called it order. He looked toward the road where Coulter Vane had disappeared, then back at the porch where Millie clung to Eleanor's skirt, and Eleanor still stood straight despite everything built to bow her. And in that moment Jonah Reed understood with a clarity sharper than any trail wind that he was not leaving in the morning, because some houses stop being borrowed the instant you decide they should not be taken. The town gathered the way dry brush catches a spark, quick and hungry, with people pretending they had only come for errands while arranging themselves where they could best witness a woman's humiliation and still call it civic duty. By the time the church bell marked 3 in the afternoon, the open space beside the water office held ranch hands, shopkeepers, 2 ladies from the dry goods store, and half the men who had laughed in the saloon on the night Jonah Reed first stepped beside Eleanor Hayes. Dust moved in low streams across the street. Wagon wheels stood idle along the boardwalk. The sun fell hard on every hat brim and window pane, making the whole town look sharper than mercy had ever required. Coulter Vane stood near the steps of the water office with his papers in a leather folio under one arm, dressed as if respectability itself had tailored his coat. The county clerk hovered by the doorway, uncertain in the shoulders. A deputy leaned against the hitch rail with the bored expression of a man who had decided in advance which side of a matter counted as easier. Eleanor arrived with Millie beside her, and Jonah 1 pace behind, not crowding her, not shielding her, only making plain by his presence that she would not stand there alone. Eleanor wore the same brown dress she had worn before, clean and mended, and carrying more dignity than any silk in the territory. Millie held Walter the cedar horse at her side, fingers wrapped around the little toy's neck until the wood disappeared in her grip. Jonah noticed people looking at the child, then at the widow, then at him, trying to fit the 3 of them into whatever story would make the day easier to stomach. He let them look. Some truths needed witnesses before they could become too heavy to bury. Coulter inclined his head as they approached. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I am pleased you chose reason." Eleanor stopped 3 feet from him. "I chose daylight," she answered. "Reason remains to be seen." A murmur moved through the onlookers, and then died when Coulter smiled that polished, bloodless smile of his. "Then let us proceed plainly. The claim stands. The debt is documented. The property will transfer unless immediate payment is rendered in full." He withdrew the papers and extended them toward the clerk, who took them with the reluctant hands of a man wishing he had called in sick to his own conscience. Jonah looked once at Eleanor. She kept her chin level. There was color in her cheeks, but not from fear alone. It was the fierce steadiness of someone tired of being asked to stand in public for a lie. "Before anything transfers," Jonah said, his voice carrying farther than he intended in the heat-stilled air, "there are papers ought to be read beside those." Coulter turned his head a fraction. "And you have become what, Mr. Reed?" "Counsel." Jonah reached into his coat and drew out the folded water receipt Daniel Hayes had kept, along with 2 more documents Eleanor had taken from a flour tin that morning after a long silence and a longer decision. One was a second receipt with a different charge for the same delivery week. The other was a note bearing the old station mark of the route foreman who used to handle North water allocation before he drank himself into retirement and left town. Not formal evidence in the grand sense. Only scraps. Yet a whole life could hide inside one small thing, and a lie often unraveled from its edge. No, Jonah said. Just a man who can count. The deputy straightened from the hitch rail. The clerk frowned and looked between the folio in his hands and the papers Jonah now held out. If the town is to witness this, Jonah continued, then let it witness all of it. Coulter's jaw tightened by a degree so slight most would not have seen it. You are delaying the inevitable with keepsakes and dead men's bookkeeping. Eleanor spoke then, and the sound of her voice cut cleaner than anger would have. No, he is delaying your comfort. That changed the air. The women on the boardwalk stopped pretending not to listen. The ranch hand nearest the trough removed his hat and held it against his leg. Even the deputy seemed less certain where to rest his eyes. The clerk took Jonah's papers, adjusted his spectacles, and began to compare dates, amounts, route markings. He read once, then again. Sunlight bounced off the lenses so no one could see his eyes, but everyone could see the careful way his fingers slowed over one line and then another. This charge, he said at last, tapping the first receipt, shows a north route delivery fee of $4.10. He lifted the second. This one, same week, same route, same acreage, shows $6.80. Coulter did not move. Seasonal adjustment. The clerk swallowed. Filed where? In-county review. Stamped where? The folio remained under Coulter's arm a shade too firmly now. That office keeps irregular hours. A few men in the crowd exchanged looks. One of the women on the boardwalk gave the smallest disbelieving sound through her nose. In a better town, maybe the moment would have turned all at once. Dust Hollow preferred to inch toward honesty, so no one had to admit how long they had helped falsehood breathe. Jonah stepped closer to the clerk and pointed to the route foreman's note. Read the mark at the bottom. The clerk squinted. North branch allocation altered by private lease instruction pending tidal pressure. He looked up. Tidal pressure. Coulter's voice cooled another 10 degrees. A note from a dismissed foreman proves only that the man was dismissed for a reason. Then read the names, Eleanor said. Her hands were steady at her sides. Reed, who received protected flow during the same period Daniel Hayes was charged penalties for shortage. The clerk hesitated. The deputy shifted. The crowd leaned without meaning to. At last the clerk opened Coulter's folio, turned 2 pages, then another. He stopped. The stillness that followed spread wider than sound. Vane Holding Lease, he read quietly. North Branch Priority Extension. Additional pasture allowance. No one spoke for a heartbeat. Then 2. Then 5. The church bell rope knocked once against the pole in the breeze and seemed indecently loud. Coulter set his hat more firmly on his head, as if posture could substitute for innocence. Business protects investment, he said. That is not a crime. No, Jonah answered. But charging a smaller claim twice while rerouting its water so the debt grows teeth starts to smell like one. The deputy came off the rail then, not dramatically, just enough to show the street had begun choosing a different shape. Mr. Vane, he said, almost apologetic. I am going to need those county review entries submitted proper before any seizure is carried out. Coulter looked at him the way a man looks at a dog that has forgotten its training. You are overstepping. Maybe, the deputy said. But public transfer on contested figures would be overstepping farther. That was the whole frontier way of justice more often than not. Not pure, not noble, just one man finally unwilling to be the easiest fool in the room. Coulter turned toward Eleanor. For the first time since arriving, he had no polished line ready. Only offense that his certainty had been interrupted. This changes nothing in the long run, he said. Eleanor met his gaze and did not blink. It changes who has to lower their eyes in town tomorrow. That struck home deeper than any accusation could have. The crowd knew it too. Jonah saw it move over them in pieces, over the men from the saloon, over the women at dry goods, over the flower boy standing barefoot on the edge of the boardwalk with one hand still white from his deliveries. They had all helped build the legend of the widow who failed by nature. Now they were looking at ledgers, lease marks, duplicated charges, and a child clutching a cedar horse while her mother stood straight in the heat and refused to be erased. A whole story was falling apart in public, and no one could claim the dust had done it. Coulter took back his folio without permission from the clerk, mounted his bay gelding with practiced precision, and gathered the reins. Enjoy the little victory, he said. Towns forget fast. Not the right things, Eleanor replied. He rode off without another word, his two hired men following in a line less neat than yesterday. The deputy asked the clerk for copies. The clerk nodded too quickly. People began to shift, but not away in laughter this time. Away in thought. Away in discomfort. The kind that comes when truth arrives wearing the face of someone you chose to misunderstand, because it was simpler that way. Millie stepped closer to Jonah and slid her hand into his without looking up. He closed his fingers around hers gently. Eleanor stood beside them, sunlight on her hair, shoulders no less burdened than they had been that morning, and yet somehow different all. The same, as if the weight had finally been named in front of others and could no longer pretend to be her fault. No one cheered. No one clapped. Out in the west, dignity seldom returned with noise. It came back the way water returns to a dry trough, slowly, quietly, until everybody around it had to admit what had been missing. 3 mornings later, the town looked the same from a distance and nothing like itself up close. Dust still skimmed the road in pale ribbons. The bell at the church still leaned a little when the wind crossed from the south. Men still tipped their hats when they wanted to seem better than they were, and the hens behind Eleanor Hayes's house still scattered at the sound of Millie's running feet. But something small and stubborn had shifted in Dust Hollow, and the proof of it began arriving before breakfast, in pieces no bigger than a man could carry with one hand. First came old Mr. Tally from the livery, walking slow with a bundle of cedar slats over his shoulder and a toolbox that knocked gently against his knee at every step. He stopped at the gate, cleared his throat like the act of decency had caught him out of practice, and said the north hinge on the shed door still sat crooked if anybody cared to do the job proper. Eleanor looked at the slats, then at the old man, then stepped aside without a speech. After him came the woman from the dry goods store with 2 flour sacks and a length of blue ribbon she claimed had been ordered by mistake. Near noon the flour boy brought a coil of fresh rope and left it on the porch rail, so quickly he nearly forgot to ask for his hat back after setting it down. Nobody called these gifts. Out in that country, people who had failed you rarely came dressed as apology. They came carrying nails, flour, rope, and the quiet wish not to be counted among the worst of themselves forever. Jonah Reed watched it happen from the yard with his hands deep in a bucket of pump water and soap, cleaning the grease from a wagon hinge he had traded an hour of labor for in town. He did not smile much. He was not built for big displays of satisfaction. But each time another small offering found its way to the porch, something in him settled deeper. Not because towns changed easy. They did not. But because even a hard place could sometimes be shamed into remembering what fairness looked like when somebody stood still long enough for the lie to wear out. Millie took every arrival as if heaven had opened a mercantile just for her yard. She greeted the rope with the same excitement she gave the ribbon, and she spent half the morning assigning Walter the cedar horse responsibility for supervising all deliveries on behalf of the household. Eleanor moved through it all with the same plain steadiness she had shown on the day of public humiliation, on the day of rain, on the day of reckoning by the water office. She thanked people when thanks were due. She refused what felt performative. She accepted only what could be used with dignity. Jonah noticed that too. She would take lumber because lumber held a wall upright. She would take flour because bread answered hunger honestly. But she sent back a lace table runner from a woman who had once crossed the street to avoid greeting her. "We do not need decoration from people who withheld decency," she said, and the sentence was so clean Jonah nearly laughed into his collar. By late afternoon the yard had taken on the look of a place expecting a future. Mr. Tally and Jonah rehung the shed door straight. The fresh rope sat wound and waiting by the pump. The blue ribbon had found its way into Millie's hair where it made her look for the first time less like a child braced against want, and more like a little girl with the ordinary right to feel pleased by color. Eleanor stood in the doorway with her sleeves rolled and a loaf cooling on the sill, sunlight along one side of her face, and bread warmth drifting out around her. Jonah had seen beautiful things before. A line of horses at dawn, snow on Wyoming pines, lightning walking a summer horizon 10 miles wide. But there was a beauty particular to that doorway, to a woman no longer lowering her eyes in her own yard. That evening, after supper, after Millie had fallen asleep in the chair with Walter tucked beneath one arm and one shoe half unlaced, Jonah stepped out too. The porch alone, and sat on the top step with his hat beside him. The sky over Dust Hollow had gone violet at the edges, with one early star just visible above the west ridge. The air smelled of bread, cedar, and the faint mineral coolness that comes after sunset on high dry ground. He heard Eleanor behind him before she sat down, the soft sound of the door, the pause, the careful fold of her skirt as she took the step beside his. For a while neither of them spoke. They had crossed too much silence honestly to ruin it now with words used only to ease discomfort. In the yard, the repaired fence cast straight dark lines over the dirt. Beyond it, the open land lay wide and waiting as it always had, indifferent to human luck, human pride, human tenderness. Jonah had once thought that bigness was freedom. He was beginning to understand it could also be emptiness if nobody on earth expected you back from it. Eleanor rested her hands in her lap and looked out over the yard. "You should go tomorrow," she said at last, though there was no force in the words. More habit than conviction. More the old grammar of disappointment than any true desire. Jonah tilted his head slightly, not toward her, just enough to show he had heard. "Should I?" She breathed in slow. "The town will begin making new stories if you stay." "It already makes stories," he said. "That is about the only crop here that never fails." That drew the smallest sound from her, not quite a laugh, but close enough to hear the road leading to one. She turned the idea over in silence. "You are free to leave," she said a moment later. "Whatever tied you here was foolishness and public meanness. Nobody could blame you for putting miles between yourself and both." Jonah looked down at his hands, at the calluses, the scar along one knuckle from a fence staple years ago, the kind of hands meant more for labor than confession. "Maybe that is true," he said. "But freedom is not always the same as wanting to go." Eleanor did not answer. The night sounds carried around them instead. A far-off dog. The creak of the pump rope shifting in the breeze. Millie murmuring in her sleep just inside the door. Jonah let the quiet stand until it had earned the next truth. "I spent a long time thinking a man was safest with nothing that could be taken from him," he said. "No deed. No porch light. No one waiting. I told myself that was living light." He rubbed a thumb against his palm once, then let his hand rest again. Turns out it was just another way of being empty. Eleanor's gaze moved from the yard to his face, slow and searching, as if she were listening not only to the words but to the years behind them. The last color of day held in her eyes for a second before thinning into dusk. "And now?" she asked. Jonah looked at the porch post where his saddle had been leaning since morning, cleaned and ready, his bedroll already tied, his canteen hung from the horn by habit more than intention. He had set it all there because leaving was what men like him did when a story came to its natural end. The trouble had eased. The papers were under review. The house still stood. The child laughed again. The widow no longer faced town alone. By every old rule he knew, that was the point where a drifting man tipped his hat and vanished into the open country before anybody was foolish enough to name what he had started to feel. Instead he rose, crossed the porch, and lifted the saddle in both hands. Eleanor watched without moving. Jonah carried it not to the steps, not to the yard, not toward the waiting road, but back inside the house where lamplight had already begun to soften the corners of the room. He set it down against the far wall beside the mending basket and the cedar crate, among the ordinary objects of a lived-in life. Then he came back to the doorway and rested one shoulder against the frame. Millie slept curled in the chair. Walter had fallen to the floor at her feet. The room smelled of cooling bread and lamp oil and the clean wood smoke of a home that had finally begun to believe in tomorrow. Eleanor was still on the step, one hand gripping the porch edge as if the moment had taken her balance in a quiet, serious way. Jonah looked at her, really looked, at the strength that had never asked to be admired, at the weariness that had never become bitterness, at the woman the whole town had mistaken for a burden when she had been carrying more grace than any of them deserved. "If I stay," he said, and his voice was low enough that the night had to lean in for it, "it will not be because of a bet." Eleanor held his gaze. The wind moved one loose strand of hair against her cheek. Somewhere down the road a screen door shut, and the town kept whatever distance decency required. She stood then and crossed the porch toward him, not quickly, not shyly, simply with the calm of someone stepping toward a truth she had made wait long enough. She did not touch him right away. She only stopped close enough that the lamplight reached them both and said, "Then stay because you were meant to be asked properly." Jonah had no grand line ready. No practiced tenderness polished in some city parlor. He only opened the door wider. Eleanor looked once toward Millie, once toward the yard that had nearly been taken, then back at the man who had first entered her life as a public joke and stayed long enough to become the one thing in it that felt solid. When she stepped inside, she did not look like a rescued woman. She looked like a person coming home to a home she had finally been allowed to keep. And Jonah Reed, who had ridden half the West believing the horizon was the only thing wide enough to hold him, stood in that small room with the saddle against the wall and understood at last that a man does not always find the life he dreams of by winning it. Sometimes he loses the hand, walks through the wrong door, and finds that Grace has been waiting there all along, in a brown dress, with flower on its sleeves and enough quiet courage to make the whole town ashamed of how long it took them to see it.